right, welcome to La Neta. I am Ben Waddell, and this week's lesson is about gender and immigration. This week, as you know in La Neta, we're going to be breaking down truths. That's the idea of this program. Every single week, we take an issue, we lay the facts on the table, and we try and understand what's happening through a simple lesson. So La Neta, we break it down in three sections. We have the lesson, we have a story, an anecdote about something that relates to the lesson, and then we have La Neta, the truth, right? So let's go ahead and jump right in. So traditionally, men migrated far more frequently than women. And in large part, this had to do with patriarchal society. Patriarchy, of course, refers to a system, a cultural system, in which men hold most of the power, both in society as well as within households. Now, in traditional agriculturally bound societies, where men held most of the power within households, if a man could not find a way to make a living for his family within the area in which he were born, he would migrate somewhere else. Now, a lot of times people would migrate, so like in the case of Mexico, men would migrate to a larger city, work, and then come home on weekends or every few months when they could, and they would send money home to help the family get by in the meantime. Or they would migrate to a place like the United States and do the same thing. Work for a certain period of time, either take money back home or send money back home in the form of remittances so that the family could subside in his absence. Now, in the 21st century, that has begun to shift. Patriarchy has begun to dissolve, or at least it has become more fractured, and we started to see women migrating at rates that historically we haven't seen before. And so if we look at this today, women are actually migrating more frequently than men for one of the first times in history. So let's look at this up close. Let's zoom in on this chart. And what we'll see is that across the world, mostly women and men are migrating at similar rates. But there are regions like North America, like Latin America, like Europe, and like Oceania, where women are actually migrating more frequently than males. And so we can actually begin to see shifting gender norms, changing the ways in which people are migrating around the world. So the question becomes, well, what all is driving this shift? If men traditionally migrated more than females, what is driving this shift towards a world in which women are now migrating as frequently and in many regions of the world more frequently than males? Well, the first thing on my list is gender norms. Gender norms have changed enormously over the last 100 years, but this is especially true of the last 20 years. This is true in the United States, but it's also true in regions around the world like Latin America, like Southeast Asia, like Africa. As women gain access to more rights, and as human rights expand areas where traditionally they had not been defended, women are able to migrate at rates in which they wouldn't have in the past. Women are no longer bound through marriage to a patriarchal home. They're able to strike out on their own, and that has led to women migrating at higher rates than in the past. Now, another shift that has taken place is the move towards service economies. As globalization has made its way into nearly every corner of the world, we've started to see women participating in the global economy through service industries in ways that they hadn't in the past. And so service industries have created, especially in nations like the United States and regions like Europe, they've created opportunities for women that didn't exist in the past. And so there are oftentimes more work opportunities in highly developed nations like the United States for women than for males. And so this is reflected within migration trends. Now, something else to keep in mind is transportation. Transportation has shifted enormously in recent decades. When we think about traditional migration, we think of individuals coming over long distances by foot, by bus, by train to get to highly developed countries that are completely disconnected from the country that these individuals came from. But we no longer live in that world. One of the things that I've noted in my own work and in taking students to places like Mexico and Nicaragua is that more and more people are migrating via airlines. So one of the things that I've noticed in Mexico, for example, is that migrants will oftentimes take a domestic flight from a place like Chiapas or from Quintana Roo in the south, in the southern part of Mexico, and they'll fly straight up to the northern border. So they'll fly into Matamoros or Ciudad Juarez or Tijuana. And so what that does is it cuts the transportation costs. It also makes for a much safer journey. Women have traditionally been persecuted by gangs and cartels in and along the routes that lead to the United States. And so as transportation becomes faster, cheaper, and more economical and safer, women are more likely to use those transportation routes to get to places like the United States. Now, the final thing that I have on this list is enduring patriarchy. One of the things that we know about the world, unfortunately, is that patriarchy has not disappeared. And this is true in developed countries. It's true in developing countries as well. And in developing countries where patriarchy is starting to fracture and where human rights, especially for gender, for women, are beginning to emerge in ways that they hadn't in the past, we see tension, we see contention arise. And so as a result of this, in countries across Latin America and other parts of the developing world, we see high levels of violence against women. And this violence against women has led a number of people, millions of people really, to migrate to places where they feel as if they have access to more rights, to employment, and to safer living conditions. And so patriarchy itself, enduring patriarchy, is part of understanding why women are migrating at higher rates today as well. All right, so I want to give you a sense of what the movements against patriarchy in Latin America have looked like in recent years. Movements against patriarchy in Latin America have been particularly high in 2019 and into 2020. And one of the movements that has gained recognition around the world is El Violador eres tú, or the violator is you, you are the violator. And so I want to turn to that. This movement started in Chile with this amazingly powerful song that you'll hear here. I'll show that, and then we'll come back for the story section of La Neta.
El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer y nuestro castigo es la violencia que no ves. El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer y nuestro castigo es la violencia que ya ves. Es femicidio, impunidad para mi asesino. Es la desaparición, es la violación. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. El violador eras tú. El violador eres tú. Son los pacos, los jueces, el Estado, el presidente. El Estado opresor es un macho violador. El Estado opresor es un macho violador. El violador eres tú. El violador eres tú. Duerme tranquila, niña inocente, sin preocuparte del bandolero, que por tus sueños, dulce y sonriente, ven a tu amante carabinero. El violador eres tú. El violador eres tú. El violador eres tú. El violador eres tú.
So femicides or femicidios are extremely high in Latin America. They're high in other parts of the developing world as well. But I want to give you a sense of what this actually looks like on the ground for the folks that are living in areas in which violence is extremely high against women. So for that, I want to turn to the story of Carla. This is the story of Carla Rostron. I never actually met Carla, and unfortunately Carla has passed away. She was murdered by the man that you see here on the screen, Francisco Mercado. Francisco was a military personnel. He was part of military personnel in Nicaragua. And I was actually living in Nicaragua when this murder took place. I lived in a place called Las Colinas de Santa Cruz, which is on the outskirts of Managua. Managua is the capital city of the country, where about 2 million people live. Carla was Francisco's ex pareja, for lack of better terms. Francisco and Carla had a relationship. That relationship was ended, and Francisco let Carla know that if he couldn't be with her, nobody could be with her. Carla found herself in a situation of need one evening and called friends. Nobody picked up. And so she finally called Francisco and asked for a ride home. Francisco, instead of taking Carla home, took her to an abandoned lot, which was right next to this long driveway into the house where I lived in Managua. And he murdered her. He sexually violated her, assaulted her twice. He stabbed her nearly 60 times, and then he decapitated Carla and buried her head in this abandoned lot behind the home that we lived in when we were in Managua. I didn't know about this until I drove home one afternoon, and there were national police up and down the long driveway that led to our home. And so I started asking what had happened, and they couldn't share too many details, but they basically told me the rundown of what had happened, and I had to walk all the way home. So I had to walk about a mile on foot in 95-degree weather with really strong high humidity, and at the whole time I was walking, I was thinking about this young woman whose life had been taken from her. And I was, of course, thinking about this man. They didn't know that it was Francisco at the time. They didn't know who had killed Carla. But I was thinking about, the type of cultural system that exists that recreates this act, right? So this was Carla had been killed in Managua, but she's one of thousands of women that are killed around the world, and certainly around Latin America every single year. And so I found myself thinking about this cultural system that reproduces violence against women year after year. And while people like Francisco need to be held accountable for their actions, we as a society need to be held accountable as well. We need to shift away from a culture that reproduces femicides. And that brings me to La Neta. La Neta this week, the truth of the matter, is that women are literally fleeing for their lives. Around the world, thousands of women every single year have to leave situations of violence against them, against their bodies, against their daughters, against their families. And this is the type of situation that we need to shift. As a society, we need to end violence against women, but we also need to end the system that recreates violence against women. We need to end patriarchy. That is La Neta. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you join us again for another episode next week. Thank you.